So welcome everyone. We're so pleased to be together today to speak with Isaac Stonefish, and we are going to discuss his new book, American Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. We've known Isaac for a number of years and share a passion for China-US relationships. I think we share a love of person-to-person relationships, whether it's Chinese food, the arts, the language. That's really where we agree and enjoy each other's companies. The China-US Women's Foundation has focused on the commonality of women's issues, 800 million women in China and the US. We have health concerns, we have children, and many things to enjoy, and that's our focus. Isaac concerns himself more with other matters, but we come together in the celebration of the relationship. So we're so pleased to be able to talk about his new book with him today. A little bit about Isaac. Isaac is the CEO and founder of Strategy Risks. He's an internationally recognized expert on Asia, ESG and strategy consultant, influential opinion writer, fluent Mandarin speaker, and skilled public communicator. Isaac is also a Washington Post Global Opinions contributing columnist, an on-air contributor to CBSN, a visiting fellow at the Atlantic Council, and the author of a monthly column on China's risk forbearance. So welcome, Isaac. Thanks for being here with us today. My first question is really about your book. Tell us, how did you decide to write it, and what were the challenges? And congratulations on its publication this week.
Thank you, Leslie. It's great to be here, and thanks everyone in the audience for tuning in. So the book started out with a frustration that I had after coming back from spending 6 years living in Beijing in late 2011. Because I realized that a lot of people that I was speaking to about China would repeat words and phrases that the party used about Beijing, about China, and about the Chinese people. Phrases that seemed quite anodyne, like China has 5,000 years of history, and China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, and China just wants peace. And the issue with these slogans are less the veracity of them. Plenty of political parties make slogans that are, in a word, true. The issue is that you're repeating party dogma. And so the analogy that I draw is the phrase, all lives matter. If 15 years ago you said all lives matter, it would be absolutely uncontroversial. Oh, great, you're a humanist, all lives matter. Today, if you say all lives matter, you're repeating a talking point that's designed to push against Black Lives Matter, you're allying yourself with the Republican Party, and you're making a very pointed and controversial political statement. So people were doing that when I was talking to them about China, in the early 2010s, the mid 2010s, and I found it especially marked in official discourse about Beijing. And it was just so strange to me to see that repeated in the United States. And Russia, which is very much in the news this week, Russia's international influence is much more about chaos for chaos's sake and bringing other countries down to Russia's level. Whereas for Beijing, it's much more about changing the perceptions of China. And as China has grown steadily more powerful and more influential, the idea of how Americans and people around the world think about China has grown increasingly important. And that pushed me to start putting this together.
I know it took you a few years to write it. Have you reached some conclusions that you didn't expect to reach when you set off on this book venture?
Well, one is a bit more prosaic. As I was writing, everyone would tell me how difficult it was to write a book. And I said, nah, I got this, no problem. And it was a lot more difficult than I was expecting. I turned in the first draft in February 2020, and my editor very politely said, this needs a huge amount of work. Please rewrite the darn thing. So I spent, the initial phase of the pandemic working on rewriting this, and I think it really helped with the book. I think I was surprised at how much Kissinger reappeared throughout history as it related to China. Perhaps the most surprising one for me was with the 1997 film Tomorrow Never Dies, a James Bond film. That is the first known Hollywood film rewritten to avoid offending Beijing. And the film's producers had worked with Kissinger, who recommended they censor it so as not to upset Beijing. So I was very surprised to see that. And I was also surprised to see Neil Bush, the brother of one president and the son of another. He also reappeared quite often throughout a lot of these sections and pieces of history that I was looking at. And it's interesting to compare him to Hunter Biden. Neil Bush is sort of what the Republicans really want Hunter Biden to be. And I think there's still probably a lot more that will come out about what Hunter Biden may or may not have done, but Neil's done a lot of business and done a lot of trading after his family name in China in ways that I found pretty striking.
That was a section of the book that I found really interesting throughout. It was your comparison of the Communist Party with United States elites like Neil Bush and Kissinger. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more, that you juxtapose the two? It's like, if not for those two problems, we would get along perfectly.
Oh, I definitely wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
I think the issue, I think, Leslie, there's a lot that you and I agree with. I think I have a lot more problems with the Chinese Communist Party than perhaps that you do. And I think the issue there is the way that individuals like Kissinger would amplify positive voices about China, suppress negative ones, focus on the positive in ways that were quite disingenuous and warping of US perceptions of China, and doing so in a way to help enrich themselves and the companies that they had. And I think, one comparison that I found very intriguing is that for Beijing, for those who enter into the Politburo, the elite 25 member body that governs China, when you leave the Politburo, it's almost impossible for you to travel overseas. And so it's such a marked contrast to where the United States is, where you can be an elder statesman and a business person. And I think, Beijing's tactic is cruel and too paranoid, but I think the US is too permissive for what it allows its ex-leaders to do. And there's been a lot of frustration among some presidents about the business that others have gone into. Nixon was very critical of Ford for quote unquote selling the presidency by joining a lot of board seats. George H.W. Bush did similar things. George W. Bush was quite reserved and I would argue quite upright in how he acted. So it's very individual, but I do think it's a problem that we have.
I think that's very well described. I've done a lot of work with Chinese companies and delegations, and I was kind of struck by, on the person-to-person level, especially with women, that's why we started the foundation, there was such understanding, and yet there were layer upon layer of other things happening that I was probably not privy to, but I understood that the person-to-person level was just one aspect of many, different things going on between China and the US. So I'd like to just pass to the current state of China-US relations. When Biden first came to the presidency, it seemed like he wanted to shift the focus on China. We got out of Afghanistan, I think, with the idea that we were moving our attention more to Asia. With the invasion of Ukraine, how do you think that's going to impact US-China relations?
I think a couple things there. I think China today is more closed than it's been at any point since maybe the late 70s and early 80s because of their I would say, quite paranoid response to the pandemic. There are certain parts of China that require a 28-day quarantine, which is absolutely insane. So the reason why there's such a lack of individual encounters is because it's very difficult for Chinese people to, well, less that it's difficult for them to leave, but very difficult for them to leave and come back. And it's very difficult for people to get into China. And that's a real shame. I'm a little bit worried. I try never to use the term people-to-people diplomacy because it's a united front term about people sanctioned or approved of by the party trying to change the way Americans think about China as opposed to people just getting together to chat, which I do very much miss. I think in terms of what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, I've been pleasantly surprised by the Biden administration's disciplined focus towards this and not pushing too hard on Russia, because I think a lot of people have the messaging backwards. I think the more involved the United States gets in the Russia-Ukraine war, the more of a free hand it gives China to potentially seize Taiwan. Whereas if the United States takes a firm stance but doesn't get bogged down, it will allow for much more deterrence that would hopefully prevent Beijing from deciding that this is a good time to seize Taiwan. On China's side, they seem to be trying to figure out how do they walk this line by providing some support to Russia, but not allowing people to really draw the parallel between Russia and Ukraine and China and Taiwan. The global, with China as an exception and India as a little bit of an exception, the global narrative is fairly clear that Russia is the aggressor and it's invading a sovereign nation. The United States doesn't even recognize Taiwan as a country. Only a little bit more than a dozen countries do. The most important of them is the Vatican City. And so if people draw comparisons to China invading Taiwan and Russia invading Ukraine, it looks bad for China because that gives further credence to the idea that I subscribe to of Taiwan as a country. The other issue is that Beijing understands that Russia is in some ways seen as an international pariah and Russia's global standing is lower than China's. And so there's a lot of lumping in together in the United States media of Russia and China in a way that I feel like is wrong for different reasons, and Beijing doesn't like because it seems to bring them down to Russia's level.
So just to follow up on that conversation, do you believe we are now returning to a state of nationalism, of international relations? I had really subscribed to a kind of the ebbing of nationalism and the growth of kind of globalism based on trade and mutual interests. With Russia invading Ukraine today and what you just described as potential for China and Taiwan, do you think that's what we can expect in upcoming years as a result of this?
It's funny. In China, it feels like it's less about nationalism and more about partyism. I don't know what the right term, sort of, it's not like 爱国主义, it's like 爱党主义. And the idea is for China less about the support of China, the country, and more about the support of the party which rules China and the party's interests. For the United States, and I mean, it's a great question. It's such a varied question depending on where we are. I mean, I hope we're not in a return to a very nationalistic us against them phase. I think on the one hand, there's so much that the United States needs to do domestically to improve itself. On the other hand, I worry sometimes about excessive focus on that because it leads to a type of whataboutism. And I think the crimes that the US has committed and continues to commit doesn't in any way justify Beijing's genocide in Xinjiang. And I know that's not the point you're making, Leslie, but just to speak of other conversations that I have, when I'm very critical of China and people say, well, yes, what about the awful things the US is doing? I say, yes, the US is doing awful things, but that implies that two wrongs make a right, and that the US's terrible history and present of racism means that China should be allowed to do something much worse, or at the very least the same thing. And I really don't buy that argument.
And following up on what you just said, if there is a rise in tension, how do you think Chinese American community should react to this tension? We have wonderful examples of Chinese Americans like Gary Locke and Dr. Wu, and most recently Eileen Gu, who said, I'm American when I'm in the United States and Chinese when I'm in China. Can we nurture this win-win stance with rising tensions?
There's a great multiplicity of views among the Chinese American community, and some have views that I agree with, some have views that I disagree with. It's so individual, and people, including myself, change their views all the time. I think that's a healthy way to have discourse. I think I am quite worried about the anti-Asian hate that we've seen in the United States recently, and I think it's very important for us to have a national conversation about, if, or frankly, when we go to war with China, because it feels quite likely that at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll be on the opposing sides of a hot war with China, whether over Taiwan or Japan or South Korea or many other countries in Asia. How do we do such in a way that does protect the rights of Chinese Americans? And I believe that for both ethical and strategic reasons. Every time a hate crime happens against a Chinese American person, it's just doing a favor to Beijing, because it allows Beijing to say, look, this country doesn't protect you, only China can protect Chinese people, is the sometimes stated, sometimes implied argument. So it's ethically wrong and strategically wrong.
Yes, so that's why I applaud, your lunches that you hold to bring together a variety of different viewpoints to talk about matters. We try to host these Zoom sessions just so that people don't think in terms of black and white all the time, but they see a nuanced approach, just like human beings are nuanced. So now I'd like to open it up to a just general discussion. You've answered my questions, and I'd like to hear what everyone else is thinking about. Lisa, would you like to start?
Yes, I'd love to. I really enjoyed your book, Isaac, and I thought it was fascinating and how you started with an example of data being owned by Chinese companies, and you used Grindr. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of Grindr going under Chinese ownership at one point?
Definitely. So several years ago, a Chinese company purchased Grindr, and they said very explicitly, oh, the Chinese government's not going to have access to your data. But that's not the way the system works in China. Regardless of whether or not that company, Beijing Kunlun, wanted to share data with the Chinese government, if the Chinese government and the Chinese military made it very, very clear that they were going to need that data, the company would have no choice but to comply. So CFIUS, a US government body, forced the unwinding of that transaction. Another US company purchased Grindr, but the chairman of that company is a Chinese American who also was running a Chinese state investment firm. And so you think, well, how secure is that data? And also, how do we have this conversation without ascribing, excuse me, without ascribing dual motives or dual nationalities to him? How can we do that in a way that's respectful and honest? And it's a difficult conversation to have, but a very necessary one.
Thank you.
Hi, Isaac. I'm wondering, now it appears that the US is attempting to pressure Russia, but you say that, oh, maybe within 5 years, there's a possibility that we would be involved with a hot war with China. So you're suggesting that pressure is the way we seem to go with Russia, but not the way we're likely to go with China. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? Thanks.
So the United States has a far more direct interest in Taiwan than it does in the Ukraine. Part of it has to do with our interests in containing China. Part of it has to do with the health of Taiwan's democracy versus the health of Ukraine's democracy. Part of it has to do with the ability of a Chinese-owned Taiwan to harry Japan. They call Taiwan an unsinkable aircraft carrier. Taiwan is quite close to some of Japan's southern islands. There's a lot of very grassroots hatred for Japan in China, and it feels, the countries have fought at least 3 wars in the past, and will almost certainly fight other wars in the future. It's what countries do. And the relationship between Taiwan and the semiconductor industry and Taiwan and global trade and global shipping. I think the other issue is that Russia is a declining power, China is a rising power. China under the Communist Party will likely be both quite nasty to its own people and quite inimical to US interests globally. But does that mean the United States, should go to war with China over Taiwan? It's not my decision to make, certainly. It's something that we should have a national debate about, and something that who's ever president at the time will have to decide. I think what worries me in those scenarios is I think it's unlikely that Beijing will, like they've been doing, like Russia's doing with Ukraine, launch an invasion in a very short period of time. I think they will probably seize an island or two occupied by Taiwan off the coast of Xiamen in southeast China, and then just wait for a while, allow people to get acclimatized to that new reality, and then perhaps do a larger slice. So, would the US go to war with China over Taiwan? Possibly. Would they go to war with China over the Taiwanese island of Matsu? Almost certainly not.
Isaac, I have another question. I had years ago, I guess, saw Richard Gere speak, and he was saying that Hollywood will no longer feature him in a major motion picture because of his Tibet stand, and his films will not be released in China. Can you talk a little bit more about Hollywood versus television and what you discovered in your research?
Okay, so the issue with Hollywood, and the reason why Hollywood studios don't feature actors like Richard Gere, who have been such long-term supporters of the Tibet movement, is less that they're worried about that individual movie not screening in China, or even the studio's movies not screening in China. They're worried about the parent company of the studio having issues. And I think it's most marked with Disney, which has so many interests in China beyond the films, with manufacturing, with its 2 theme parks, one in Hong Kong, one in Shanghai, that have pretty heavy government oversight and control. And what happened with film is that in 1997, studios made 3 movies that had portrayals of Chinese that the Communist Party found to be too critical. 7 Years in Tibet, Kundun, and a film, Red Corner, with Richard Gere as someone unjustly imprisoned in China. And Beijing responded by restricting the studio's business in China. The CEO of Disney infamously apologized to the premier Zhu Rongji. And after a long period of back and forth, the studios basically were able to learn from Beijing how to self-censor in a way that pleased the party. And television, for a variety of reasons, never learned that lesson, and I think it's better for it.
Thank you.
Isaac, I have 2 questions for you. Number one is, I can't wait to read your book. You have very interesting insights. I really can't wait. What do you think is going to happen, to the China-US business relation? It's kind of like a very confusing. You constantly you see a new list of sanctions, to the Chinese company, and China. I come back with some retaliation, and then coming January, the last January, there was a new list of sort of a small boom of Chinese company listed in New York Stock Exchange. So they are expecting new boom of IPOs. So it's like all confusing to me. So that what do you think is going to happen between China, US business-wise? My second question is, you lived in China for 6 years, but compared to 5,000 years of history, it's nothing, right? China, like some mentioned 5,000. So I'm just very curious, like when you write this book, it's you know, have all kinds of different parts and you know, insights. So what is the most challenging part for you when you write that book?
So the Communist Party has ruled China for, what is it, 73 years now, which in the space of Chinese history is such a drop in the bucket. And so I think we do want to understand, you know, my perspective is quite limited, you know, and much more limited than the party's, of course. But when you look at the whole breadth of Chinese history, the party is just a small, very likely aberration. And we don't know what'll happen after, if it'll go back to more of an imperial system, if it'll be a democracy, it'll be a different type of dictatorship. But I think one of the reasons I don't like the phrase China has 5,000 years of history is it implies that the party is more connected to that history and that it's an apogee of that history. No one says Syria has 5,000 years of history or Egypt has 5,000 years of history, even though those countries do as well. It's a, you know, China is not unique in having a long civilization. Other countries do as well. The challenge, the most difficult thing for me about writing the book. So one of the reasons I focused so much on Americans in the book is it's so difficult to get certain types of information out of China. You know, part of it was that I was no longer living in Beijing when I was doing the writing, but part of it is that the links between politics and business in China are so important. They're so much more opaque than they are in the United States, and it's so much more dangerous for the people that you write about. So that was a real challenge. In terms of the first question and where the business community, the business relationship is evolving, I think US companies in China face two main political challenges. And the most important one is just, you know, working with the party's interests. I think in terms of the mood for the US business community in China, the most important story for a lot of them wasn't what the US has done and geopolitical tensions, but how Beijing cracked down on Alibaba, how Beijing cracked down on Didi. You know, what happened to the CEO of Meituan, I think it was, after he tweeted a poem about an early emperor book burning and suddenly saw a huge erasure of value from his stock. So I think we want to be careful not to have this conversation in a US political vacuum and forget about the strong leftward movement that Beijing is taking the business community in China. I think in terms of trade and US-China opportunities, there's certainly much less of an appetite on both sides for investment. And there's plenty of exceptions to this, which is a reason why you still have people, you know, very excited. Beijing will often find certain companies and allow them to be the poster child for openness. We've seen that a lot with Tesla. We see that a lot with Goldman Sachs. We see that with Starbucks. So there are US companies that are flourishing in China. There's a lot of difficult choices they have to make, a lot of sacrifices they have to make. And I think Chinese companies, in part because it's so difficult for them to go overseas right now because of the COVID restrictions, and in part because the US is quite worried about national security and the role that Chinese companies play, have much less of an opportunity to expand here than they did 4 or 5 years ago.
I was fascinated, Isaac, fascinated when I heard you talk the other day at, I think, the Atlantic Council. The topic came up about with common prosperity, how companies now are expected to do all of these steps. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
So the common prosperity is an idea of how businesses should give back to the Chinese people. And it's one of those, on the one hand, fantastic. There's a problematic wealth gap in China, and a lot of people have been left behind by China's development. On the other hand, a lot of Chinese businesses feel like they're basically being coerced into giving a lot of money to charities that are opaque and government controlled. And in some ways, you know, they're basically bribing these entities in order to meet these new political diktats. And so I think it's tough because of issues around transparency. It could be that, a company gives $30 million to a charity fighting rural poverty, and the money goes, most of it goes to farmers, and it actually improves their livelihood and, functions as sort of a very ethical wealth distribution. Or it could be that, a lot of this goes to various people within the party, either as a corruption or sort of to increase some of the party's influence over places that perhaps we think it shouldn't be. And this is an example of rent seeking by state-owned enterprises and state entities.
I have a follow-up question from, I think, Steve Blight. He says, if the US declares no boots in Ukraine, a sovereign country, why would the US defend Taiwan, which the US recognizes literally as a province of China and with no mutual defense treaty like the US has with Japan?
The US doesn't recognize Taiwan as a province of China. It is as ambiguous as it can be about Taiwan's international standing. And the US has so many more interests in Taiwan and with Taiwan, even though it doesn't recognize it as a country. And the reason why the US treats Taiwan differently, besides what we were talking about before with trade and semiconductors and defending Japan, is that the US is now really starting to realize that Russia's not a threat to American interests globally, and China really is. And China, with Taiwan under its control, would be more of a threat to US interests. I think there's also an idea that is either naive or prescient, depending on what happens in the future, that Taiwan is the most likely spur of democracy in China. It's the only democratic polity in the Chinese-speaking world. It belies the idea that Beijing says that Chinese people can't have democracy or it's not right for them culturally because Taiwanese are Chinese according to the mainlanders, not according to many Taiwanese, but according to Beijing, and Taiwan is a democracy. So again, whether or not Singapore is not a democracy. It likes to pretend it is. It's not. The issue with Taiwan democratizing China is, right now very much just a pipe dream, and I would argue is unlikely to happen. But stranger things have happened and will continue to. So we'll see how that evolves.
So I was wondering, we've been talking a lot about appearances and the role of appearances here. And so I have sort of two questions along those lines. The first has to do with the Olympics and Putin and China, and then what China's interest might have been in having Putin appear with the Chinese leadership at the beginning of the Olympics. And the second has to do with the US business interests in China. If the US, if such business interests were to sort of maintain the appearances to a certain extent that China would like to see, would they be able, to what extent would they be able to maneuver behind the scenes because they had accorded China that little gift? Thanks.
I think I would love to be a fly on the wall in conversations between Xi Jinping and Putin, and I have absolutely no idea how much heads up Putin gave Xi, how much they're coordinating. I think it certainly gives credence to the idea that there's been a lot of planning because of the statements the leaders have made and the time that they spent together over the last couple of weeks. And I would also really love to know what Xi got out of Putin for this. One imagines that this is China doing Russia a big favor and that Putin has given something quite significant in return. I have absolutely no idea what that is, but I'm very, very curious to know. And it might be something that comes out when these cables get declassified decades hence, or from an intrepid reporter who's able to find out what they were talking about. I think in terms of the business community, I think Beijing excels at rewarding companies that lobby for its interests in Washington and then punishing companies that don't. However, it's uneven in this punishment and reward, because if it were too straightforward about it, it'd be far less effective of a system. So sometimes a US company will lobby for Beijing's interests, and then because they're going against the Chinese company that's more powerful, or for a whole host of other reasons, doesn't get what they want in China. And what Beijing hopes for that is, oh, this will just make them push harder so that they'll get what they want. And then sometimes, companies do things that Beijing sees as very much against its interests, either in China or outside of China, and there's absolutely no consequences, or it's positive for them. So it's a similar model for movies and TV and individuals. There are plenty of people who are very, very critical of Beijing who have had no pushback, no harassment, and then plenty of people who've been very, very mildly critical and have. And it's a stronger system if you have to guess, oh, if I say this, will I be okay? If I say that, will I be okay? As opposed to knowing, oh, okay, well, this is a very clear line, and so I'm safe if I'm on this side of it.
I have a question. I was struck, I was at an event at another think tank, and they were talking about Russia. And the speaker made a great point about how Russia only has 144 million people, and therefore they're not very significant in the world sphere. Do you find that there's a lot of emphasis, given that obviously China is so large with population and dwarfs obviously Taiwan at 23 million people. Does that come up a lot in these conversations? The size of the populations?
I think it brings up an important point about China-Russia relations, which is that Russia has a lot more to fear from China than it does from the United States. And there's long been worries about Chinese influence in Russia's sparsely populated Far East. It's very easy to imagine growing Beijing's influence there. There's a lot of fears about Chinese influence in Central Asia, which has long been a backyard of Russia's influence, and also even in countries like Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I think it's an important thing to distinguish Putin's interest from Russia's interest. Putin has a lot more to fear from the West than he does from China, but for Russia, it's the reverse. And it's just like having these conversations, China has different interests from the Communist Party, and the Communist Party has different interests from Xi Jinping. But often we use these as a shorthand when we're discussing. In terms of China's size, I think the Chinese diplomats will often use that as a way to Bigfoot in conversations. I remember seeing a PowerPoint with China, Israel, and it was sort of like a little sliver of Israel superimposed across China's map. China geographically is roughly the same size as Canada, and I can never imagine a Canadian diplomat, putting Israel in the map of Canada, saying like, look how small and insignificant you guys are. So I feel like they do that as a way to say we are a presence, and we must be heard.
Thank you.
What we haven't talked about is the rise of China-European relations, the fact that 60 trains are leaving, I think, daily from China and going into Germany, and there's, growing trade. And so while I have seen a united front against Russia in their invasion of Ukraine, would you expect that kind of unity between the United States and Europe in dealing with China if China were, say, to become aggressive towards its neighbors?
No, and I think it's one thing that worries US policymakers. It's very country specific. The UK is growing increasingly critical of Beijing. The new German chancellor seems to be slightly more critical than Merkel was, but not all that much. France is somewhere in between. Italy oscillates. Lithuania has really been facing the brunt of Chinese trade aggression. The mayor of Prague has been very critical. We don't see very much from Poland. We don't see very much from the rest of Southeast Europe. So I think especially with Russia as an aggressor in Ukraine, if China were to invade Taiwan in the very near term, I think you'd have a lot of distracted European countries that wouldn't be the same level of ally to the United States that the United States might want if it were to happen a little bit later. I think one other reason why Beijing is not trying to draw itself too close to Russia is because it doesn't want to alienate European countries that really don't appreciate what Russia's doing and very much see Russia's moves as beyond the pale. I think trade-wise, again, it depends on the country, but I think broadly speaking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that every European country is more open to Chinese investment vis-a-vis other countries' investments than the United States is. And so I think Chinese companies are aware of that. That window might be closing in the UK and it might be closing elsewhere, but for now, I think that's the case.
So we've seen the Chinese assistance diplomacy sort of blossoming in various places. And I wonder what you think is that the Chinese are expecting from this. Are they expecting, for example, a broadening of their influence and a better connection with resources? Or are they hoping that these countries will become tied to China in some way? Or is it just sort of something in the background that they're doing just in case other things go wrong? Or perhaps some other explanation that you might have. Thanks.
I think you did a great job of answering your own question. I think it's all of the above. I think those are good descriptions for it. But the one thing that I would add is that, often when a country promises aid, there's a disconnect between how much it promises and how much it actually gives. And I would love to see better auditing of the numbers, how much actually gets distributed, who do they get distributed to? Is Beijing's numbers accurate here? And they do often tie these donations to a certain type of political fealty. So, okay, we can give it to this organization, but we're not going to give it to this organization because they hosted the Dalai Lama or they ran an article critical of China's policies in Hong Kong. So I think that in some ways folds into the way that you let it out. It's a way of buying influence, and it's something the U.S. does as well, and a lot of other countries do as well. So I think there are the subterfuge angles of that, but I think broadly speaking, the sort of the above the ground pieces are not terribly dissimilar from what the United States does.
Isaac, what we haven't talked about, and it's something that the China-US Women's Foundation focuses on, is students, the relationship of students. We run a summer internship program and try and enlist Chinese students and American students in programs and projects to increase understanding. And that's been kind of a win-win situation. We're really committed to helping students kind of climb out from the impact of the pandemic. And we're already underway basically coordinating with businesses to launch this for the summer. Is there something I'm missing in terms of like what's coming our way in terms of student interaction? Do you think that's an area that China is going to try to control more than they have in the past?
I think so much of that is pandemic dependent. And at some point, Beijing will evolve its pandemic strategy, and absolutely no idea when that'll be, but that'll just make it so much easier. I think the one thing I'm very keen on is more Americans learning Chinese. I think that's incredibly important and something that has slipped over the last several years, much to America's detriment. I think in terms of Chinese students at universities, I think it's a very, and for organizations like your own, it's a very difficult line to walk because on the one hand, we want to encourage Chinese students to say whatever they'd like to say and to try on different ideas. Remember when I was in college, part of the fun of it is you have these different intellectual identities, you see what fits, you talk about them, you think, oh, I agree with this, and then you don't, and you learn by trial and error. But I think there was a University of Minnesota student who was arrested and returning to China for tweeting critical things about Xi Jinping. So many other examples that don't get reported of Chinese students being harassed either by other Chinese students or by the party for them sharing their views. And so I think it's something that academics and nonprofit organizations need to be very cognizant of. It's, how do you create a safe space for them and not encourage them to censor? It's a hard one. It's a hard line to walk.
I have another question. Oh, sorry, Ella, you go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So I grew up in the UK, and I basically didn't study anything to do with China, throughout all 18 years. And Chinese wasn't a language available to me. So coming to the US, I jumped at the chance. But even comparing the amount of people that were in my first year class, was there had to be 2 classes because there were so many students that wanted to learn, about 50. And by the time I was in my senior year, they were considering not running the program because so few people wanted to learn Chinese. And a lot of them had moved over to learn Korean or Japanese. That just definitely seemed more popular. I wonder what you think the repercussions are of so few people studying Chinese as a language, and in particular in combination with not actually getting to experience China. Like I myself wasn't able to study abroad. So I was an East Asian studies major who's never set foot in any Chinese speaking country. And it feels like I don't really have a right to say that I studied Chinese because I haven't been there. So yeah, I wondered what you think the repercussions are for the future.
I think it's, yeah, and I think that's a great point. I think it is really sad that it's so difficult to get to China right now, and even that it's difficult to get to Taiwan. I think the part of the reason why the numbers have gone down is because of the difficulty of going to China. Part of the reasons are the increased repression in China. Part of the reasons is that there's less of a sense that if you go and speak Chinese, you'll get a good job in the US. It's not, I think there's a worry, and I think this should change. I don't like this phenomena, but for those who want to go into government, spending time in China is more so seen as a liability because it means you're more likely to be compromised or have compromising things happen to you. And I think that's too bad. I think it's nice to be able to go and see the place. I think it's so hard to know. I mean, if I were 21, I would certainly want to go and live in China again, but it was such a different place. And I remember I was there in 2006, and I'd always roll my eyes when people who were in their 30s would say, "Oh yeah, I was there in the 90s. It was so different." But yeah, it's now a lot less friendly of a place to foreigners. And I think also another reason why fewer people are studying is that there are a lot more sophisticated, experienced Chinese people who can do the jobs that were once reserved for expats. And, so they don't need to send someone on an expat package to run a pet company when there are plenty of Chinese people who speak brilliant English and can do that as well. But I've only been to Taiwan once. I'll need to go back because that's sort of where I'll get my China fix. But I would say going there, spending a lot of time there, it's not the same as being on the mainland, but it is probably the second best thing. There are plenty of mainlanders there. You can learn how to speak, that proper Northeastern Chinese too while you're there with the right teachers. So yeah, good luck. I hope you find your way out there.
Isaac, I want to just ask, as a women's foundation, and we're interested in the equality for women, I've been struck, people often will say, oh, China, they empower women. Mao said the women hold up half the sky. But when you look at the Politburo and the Communist Party, it looks heavily old white men or old, Chinese men. But what do you see? What did you see living there and with your research?
Same. Yeah. I mean, it's a very patriarchal society. And I think, Korea and Japan have really big problems with this. If you put China in that context, it's in a more favorable light. But if you put it in the context of Western nations, it's doing quite a poor job. There have not been very powerful Chinese women in politics. There's Mao's wife. Deng Xiaoping's wife had a little bit of influence. There's, I think, one woman in the Politburo right now, but those are fairly low numbers. We see it some in the business community, some in the arts community, but I would say that broadly speaking, China is a lot less equal towards women than the United States is. That said, from where, under Mao, Chinese women didn't hold up half the sky, but they certainly had so many more rights than they did under Imperial China. It was one of the things that Mao did successfully. He abolished foot binding, which was incredibly common in 19th century China, basically crippling women so that their feet look like lotus petals. He didn't fully end concubinage. There's a lot of wealthy men in China today who have things that are somewhat similar to the old system, but it's no longer socially acceptable to have 2 wives or several wives as it was. Female illiteracy in China was so high, and now it's very, very low. So compared to any time before 1949, there was some very, very clear advances, but compared to Western countries, it's still quite low.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Okay, well, Isaac, I want to thank you so much for joining. I hope everyone is now inspired to go out and buy Isaac's book, America's Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. I feel much more informed about global affairs, China's role, the American relationship. Clearly, everything is moving so quickly. So hopefully, Isaac, you'll come back and we'll have another conversation. I think the main thing is that we're talking to each other. We're having these conversations. We're putting our best good intentions towards the conversation, and I'm sure good things will result from that. I hope you all will join us. We have many upcoming programs. On March 31st, we have Dana Robbins, who's going to provide us with an overview of global poetry, including poets from the United States and China. I took a course with Dana, and now I quote poetry all the time, and people are impressed, and it's a source of pleasure. So I hope you'll join us for that. Please sign up for our newsletter, check out our website. We also highlight other activities that are China related. So in the meantime, I wish you all stay safe. We're still in the middle of this pandemic, so there's a lot going on, but I think by being together, we'll be stronger. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you, Isaac.
Thanks, Isaac.
The link for the
Bye-bye.
book is in our chat.